First half of February 1943. Stalingrad has fallen. If war was rational, if the Nazis were rational, the Germans would now negotiate peace, or at least concentrate any forces they have to the military war in the East. But neither is war nor are the Nazis rational, so they do the irrational, fight those who have no chance of beating them anyway. Regardless if it's cowardice, fanaticism, just plain stupidity, or all three, the effects will be wholesale death and destruction. This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus Olsson. As January ended, the surviving Jews inside the Warsaw Ghetto had driven back the Nazis and now hold the ghetto. The United Nations allies declared total war on the Axis, and Germany was preparing for their total war at home. The German situation in Stalingrad was dire, and the Germans at home found out. In Henan, China, the famine continued to reap tens of thousands of lives every week, as it continues to do now. Reports of cannibalism and parents selling their children for food are frequent. One eyewitness describes how scarce food is. The money that comes from selling a human being is not enough to buy 240 kilograms of grain. In general, in China, the war has seen little to no movement, as the Japanese have been forced to concentrate their fighting to the Pacific War. Inside the Japanese POW camps and civilian internment camps, the drudgery of everyday terror and abuse continues. In occupied Yugoslavia, a combined army of Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Croats, and Serbs descended on the outnumbered communist partisans. As the operations began, the partisans controlled small regional pockets that are not all connected. The Axis idea was to lay a noose around the whole region and sweep up the partisans' strongholds in an inward motion. They met unexpectedly hard resistance by the partisans, who are increasingly better armed and trained, in part with the help from the British Special Operations Executive. As the Axis offensive now starts to make headway, the partisans preempt them with a series of coordinated counterattacks at various locations. The various attacks run in a general southwest direction towards a line running from Prozor to Rama to Jablanica to Konjic, and setting up a communication line to their forces near Sarajevo. While it doesn't succeed to stop the Axis, it doesn't allow the Axis to force the main part of the partisan forces into battle. The unexpectedly hard resistance slows them down so that their initial objectives for January are only reached now in the first half of February. The Axis push the partisans out of most of their positions in Lika, Kordun, Bania, Sazinska Krajina, and besiege their stronghold at the Grmech mountain. Surrounded, Grmech falls on the 10th after the partisans and the majority of civilians decide to make a run for it. During the escape, 2,000 freeze to death. Out of the civilians left behind, 400 are murdered by the Axis as they invade. On the 15th, Weiss 1 is concluded without having eliminated all partisan pockets in the swept regions, but the Axis start preparing for Weiss 2, while the main part of partisan forces are retreating towards their initial line and the river Neretva. As the operations proceed, thousands of civilians are among those killed. Not as collateral damage or by impulse, but as policy, because as we have seen on Hitler's direct orders, they are to shoot or hang anyone remotely suspected of supporting the partisans, including women and children. And they do exactly that. Their pursuit of resistance to their war of expansion is a war of wholesale sadism, especially virulent within their terror camp and extermination system. On January 27th, 230 French women who had been arrested over the past 2 years arrive at the women's camp at Auschwitz II, Birkenau. Many of them are resistance operatives like Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, who led several cells in the communist resistance network Front National. Others are just ordinary people who did something that offended the German Nazis or French Vichy rulers, like the youngest among them, Rosa Floch, who was arrested this past December for writing the sign for Allied Victory V on the walls of her school and altering a sign saying "Long live the Germans" into "Long live the English." They arrived from the transit camp Fort-Romainville, where on January 21st and 22nd, the women and 1,446 men were selected for deportation. The men were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The women went to Birkenau. The 5-day transport is bestial. Ice-cold cattle cars, no sanitation, only a sparse amount of food at one stop, and very little to drink. When they finally arrive, they are given bowls of watery gruel to eat. Despite being famished, many refuse to eat on account of the red enamel bowls emitting a foul stench. Those who don't eat are fortunate. In the night, the bowls have been used by camp inmates suffering under a current dysentery outbreak to relieve themselves. They have not been washed. Herded into the camp, they are taken to rooms where they have to strip naked. Their personal belongings are taken away and their hair is cut off and pubic hair shaved. They are then disinfected by being scrubbed down with cloths soaked in gasoline in a scorching steam bath. At the next station, they get their inmate numbers tattooed on the lower arm. They are now the numbers between 31,625 and 31,854. Why these events will be remembered as Le Convoi des 31,000, the transport of the 31,000s. Then they are given striped pajamas that fit badly with a red triangle for political prisoner. They have to sew in an F for France on the triangle themselves. These and a pair of rudimentary shoes are now their only clothes. The next 2 weeks they spend in quarantine. They are separated from the earlier inmates, not forced to work yet, but have to report for the daily roll call, standing outside in the grueling cold for hours on end in their inadequate clothes. Together, they try to shield the most vulnerable among them by keeping them in the middle. The first woman to die from hypothermia and exhaustion is 63-year-old resistance operative Marie Grabe. A few days in, 43-year-old Suzanne Constantin is beaten so badly by one of the guards for a minor infraction that she eventually dies. 46-year-old Yvonne Cavé dies of frostbite after her shoes are stolen by another inmate, and several more deaths follow. But now, on February 10th, things get even worse. The all-women SS guards want to cull the weakest inmates to make place for new arrivals. Their method will be remembered as the race. At 3 a.m., all 15,000 women in the camp are woken for roll call. They are taken to the grounds outside the camp where they have to line up in rows. Here, they have to stand without food, without water, for the next 15 hours. Dozens break down. Several die already during this part of the torture. At 5 p.m., those still standing are forced to run as fast as they can back into the camp. The guards goad them on using cudgels as they have to run through a gauntlet leading back into the camp. 1,000 who are too old or too weak to stand all day or run fast enough are separated out, as are a small group of the strongest. When the race is over, the 1,000 women are taken to the gas chambers and murdered. The stronger group must then dispose of their bodies. Several of the 31,000 women are among those murdered this day. In the end, only 49 will survive the war. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier will be one of them. Rosa Floch will not. She will die of unknown causes in the camp already in March this year, age 17. The survivors will suffer mental and physical disabilities for the rest of their lives, and only one will say that she has lived a happy life despite it all. In the Netherlands, Nazi reprisals this month will also lead to similar results. After lobbying for power for almost 3 years, on February 1st, 1943, the Dutch collaborationist leader Anton Mussert is allowed to form a shadow cabinet to advise Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who governs occupied Netherlands. One of Mussert's cabinet members is Hendrik Seifert, in charge of special services. He's a Dutch ex-general who served as a figurehead for the Dutch Waffen-SS Legion. The Dutch resistance group, CS6, led by one of the early resistance organizers, neurologist Dr. Gerrit Castijn, now fear that the addition of Mussert's cabinet to the government will lead to general conscription for the Dutch, and decide to take disruptive action. On February 5th, Seifert is shot on his doorstep by a CS6 operative, Dutch student Jan Verloon. Seifert dies a day later, but only after he identifies his killer as a student. On the 6th, Nazi authorities order 600 random students from several universities to be taken hostage at the Dutch concentration camp in Vught. The next day, CS6 assassinate another member of Mussert's cabinet, the man in charge of propaganda, Hermanus Redon, and his wife. Unfortunately, the gun used in the assassinations had been given to Gastein by an SS Sicherheitsdienst double agent as a plant to follow in case it was used. Gastein is arrested, but leaps out of the window of his interrogation room and kills himself. In the following days, another 1,200 men aged 18 to 25 are arrested. The majority will eventually be released, while a few hundred will end up in concentration camps abroad, where they will meet similar fates as the women of the Convoi des 31 000. But it's in Eastern Europe that the Nazi terror still rages most violently. In Belarus, of the roughly 400,000 Jews who lived there when the war broke out, 225,000 have been murdered so far. Others have fled, and some have escaped to join the partisans. Around 23,000 Jews remain in the Belarusian ghettos, but not for long. The largest ghetto is in Minsk, where 9,000 Jewish people have been living since the large action of July 1942. They've endured hunger, cold, disease, and repeated murder actions. As we have seen, an unusual number managed to escape to the woods and join the partisans. The Nazis started to liquidate the ghetto completely in January 1943, and the Minsk Jews are now once again gradually disappearing into the woods. But this time, it's not to join the partisans. On February 4th, 500 Jews of the Perishka ghetto in Novgorodok are led to murder pits out of town and shot. On February 8th, between 4,000 and 5,000 Jews in the Slutsk ghetto are rounded up by the men of Eduard Strauch, head of the Sicherheitspolizei und Sicherheitsdienst im Generalkommissariat Weiss Ruthenien, occupied Belarus. They force the Jews to the nearby village of Mechorta, where they are shot. Parallel to the ghetto liquidations, the Nazi launch Operation Hornung the same day. Ostensibly, it's an anti-partisan action, but the partisans are by now far too well organized and armed for the German forces to go after them directly. Instead, Franz Magil, deputy commander of the SS Sondereinheit Dierlewanger, orders the destruction of anything that might even remotely help the partisans. His men go from village to village in a 2-week orgy of arson, rape, and mass murder of defenseless civilians with little or no relation to the partisans. By the end of the operation, over 12,000 have been murdered. These are non-Jewish Belarusians, considered to be Slavs by the Nazis, also slated for extermination or enslavement. And as we saw in December, the Nazi war of extermination shall now also include a new group, the Sinti and Roma. They too are considered to be a threat to the purity of the Aryan race, which is ironic considering their cultural origin. They are an ethnic Indo-Aryan nomadic culture. In any case, they are redefined as asocial elements and are to be purged completely, just like the Jews. After Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler's order on December 16, 1942, to round up all Sinti and Roma in reach of the Germans to concentration camps, most were sent to Auschwitz to be worked to death, where a separate Zigeunerlager has now been established. But now in February, hundreds of men, women, children, and infants are also sent to the Treblinka extermination factory to be murdered immediately by asphyxiation in the gas chambers. Across the extermination factories, even now that Operation Deinhard is largely over, every day more than 2,000 people are gassed to death. Together with the murders by gunshot further east, Jews worked to death or just randomly killed. The death toll in the Holocaust for these 2 weeks is around 50,000. That brings the total number of men, women, and children considered to be Jewish by the Nazis murdered so far to over 3.2 million. In contrast, the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS report to have suffered roughly a third of that, 1,164,200 dead and missing since the war began until end of February 1943. If you add to the Nazi murder toll the Soviet POWs starved to death, those killed in concentration camps and euthanized, the preemptive resistance mass murders, and those who were worked to death in forced labor, the German Nazi Reich has now murdered close to 7 million people, 6 times the number of German soldiers who have fallen. And while the mass genocides continue in the East, many French POW in German custody are about to get an unusual form of relief: conjugal reunification. Well, to be frank, it's another forced labor program with some twists. Wives of French POWs are allowed to join their husbands in Germany if they become voluntary laborers themselves. This backfires in a, for the Nazis, unexpected way. The SS laments that it is exacerbating the rising housing shortage due to Allied bombing. You see, everyone, especially the Nazis, find it morally unthinkable that married couples would have to share housing. The SD are concerned about the effect on morale for regular Germans. Adding to such concerns, they complain that many British POW live better than most Germans thanks to the generous care packages from home delivered by the Red Cross, full of desirable stuff unattainable for most Germans by now. The British are even running black markets, selling cosmetics, canned goods, and candy at hiked prices, further increasing their economic advantage. But despite the grumbling of the SS, it seems that Germany is reluctant to crack down or treat their POW too badly at this point. Perhaps because they are now worried what more and more of their own will reap. With the surrender at Stalingrad, roughly 91,000 German soldiers are added to the 200,000 POW already held by the Soviets, including Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus himself, and 21 of his generals. Underfed and exhausted after months of intense fighting, they are now forced to make a long winter march to their POW camps. Joseph Goebbels is concerned about their fate, probably assuming that the Soviets are no better than the Nazis themselves. Even signs of life and well-being by German POW don't alleviate his misgivings. Back in December, he wrote, "For the first time, German prisoners of war in Russia have been heard from. Some 400 to 600 postcards have arrived in the Reich from Russian POW camps, all of them without any propaganda. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks no doubt have a propaganda purpose in mind with these tactics. Although they have not signed the Geneva Convention, they are now trying to pose as civilized and cultured people. In the future, the cards themselves are no longer to be handed out to those next of kin." He's not entirely wrong to be skeptical. While the postcards are real, they don't show the whole picture. With increasing scarcity of food and supplies to keep the war going, the comfort, safety, and well-being of German captives is not a Soviet priority. In the camps, hunger, hypothermia, and disease is commonplace, especially for the lower-rank soldiers. Those now captured at Stalingrad have it especially bad. Many succumb on the journey or shortly after arriving at their camps. Some are tortured by Soviet guards in the hope of extracting intelligence. But most suffering is caused by the marches and general prison camp conditions. Of the 91,000 prisoners taken at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 will ever see Germany again. It seems odd, perhaps pathetic, or at least ironic, that a nation that has chosen to disregard all rules of war are now the ones worried that the enemy might also not honor them. From the first day that Germany invaded Poland and began this war, it has been driven by fantasies of victimization, that the world was in cahoots to defeat, even eliminate Germany and the Germans, when no one really was. But by now, the Nazi pack of wolves seem to have fulfilled their own fantasy. They are being beaten. Stalingrad has fallen. Acts of resistance against their occupation are rising across the lands. Even their best-controlled microstates of terror are challenged, like in the Warsaw Ghetto, now under the victims' control as the Jewish resistance holds the ghetto. But like a wounded animal, the Nazis will bite back, claw at anything that moves, and mark my words when I tell you that this rabid rubble is far from done fighting against humanity, hell-bent as it seems to bring death into the world, even if it will ultimately be their own. If the world wants it or not, from here on out, there will be no quarter, not for anyone. Never forget.